Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be going through the basics of charcoal drawing. And so this video is mainly aimed at beginners that are interested in using charcoal or are having trouble with using charcoals for their drawings. And so I'm going to be going through the basics of the materials, the shading, the blending, and all of that stuff to give you an overview of how to use charcoal to create some really cool drawings. So let's get straight into it by going through first the materials that I like to use for my charcoal drawings. So I don't use too many materials when drawing with charcoal, which makes this a great medium because it's an affordable option for beginners. So let's start with the pencils, and I only use two charcoal pencils. I use a H pencil for lighter shading and a 2B charcoal pencil for the shadows. I also use a charcoal block, and this is normally a soft charcoal block, and I use that for shading in large areas. And it's great because it shades in large areas really quickly, and it's good for making charcoal powder that we can add to our drawing with a paintbrush. And that's good for creating smooth and really light values. Now the paper I like to use is one that has a bit more tooth and texture to it. You can use any paper designed for use with charcoal, and you can also use watercolor paper, which is one of my personal favorites. The paper needs to be able to grip though onto multiple layers of charcoal, which means that you don't really want a paper that is too smooth. So for example, the Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper wouldn't be a good option when using charcoal. So try and steer away from using really smooth, slick papers. Personally, I use the Strathmore Bristol Vellum paper for my charcoal drawings, but I've also used hot pressed watercolor paper in the past, and that works really well as well. Now, in terms of blending tools, I use a couple of different supplies for blending my charcoal drawings. So I always try to avoid using my fingers as much as I can, as this method is not only messy, but your hands have a lot of oils on them, which can transfer to your drawing paper and give you blotchy results. So instead, I use paintbrushes, tissue, and blending stumps for blending. So paintbrushes, firstly, are great for blending charcoal shading as it gives really smooth results, and it also gets rid of any graininess. And also paintbrushes are really easy to control. I also love paintbrushes because they are great at blending out the skin for portraits, and that's one of my favorite ways to use the paintbrush is for blending out skin. It gives really soft results. So also tissues are brilliant for blending out larger areas. So you can get really smooth results with tissues as well. In fact, it removes even more graininess, I think, than paintbrushes do. So what I do is I wrap the tissue around my finger, and I then blend using the tissue in circular motions. And finally, blending stumps. These are great for blending out the small details that is really hard to blend using a paintbrush and a tissue because they are too large for painting out the tiny details. So the blending stumps are great alternatives if you need to blend out tiny details in the eyes. And blending stumps, for you guys that don't know, are made from compressed paper, and for a pack of them they're really cheap. So they are another affordable tool, as well as tissue that's really affordable. Now moving on to highlights, I like to use two different supplies for getting in highlights. So highlights is a key part of the drawing process for me, and so I use two different erasers, like I said, when drawing with charcoal. Mainly I use the Tombow Mono Eraser, which is a stick eraser, and I use that to add in detailed highlights and to also add texture to my drawing. But for the more subtle highlights, I like to use a kneaded eraser instead. Now those are all of the materials that I use for my charcoal drawings, and before I move on to talking through the whole drawing process, if you want to see how I created this drawing in real time, then it is available over on my Patreon, along with over 300 other real-time tutorials that you can access for just a small amount per month. For each real-time tutorial there will be the full narration and also all of the references, sketch outlines, and materials lists you need to follow along with the tutorials yourself. But if a monthly membership isn't right for you, or you just want to focus on improving your charcoal drawing skills, then over on my website I've got lots of different courses to help you master charcoal drawing. I've got a course on there for drawing portraits in charcoal, also drawing animals in charcoal, and still life objects in charcoal. But if you really want to improve your skills, you can get all 3 of those courses in my drawing bundle. And if you are interested in my courses, you can get 15% off if you use the code SAVE15 at checkout. So I really recommend checking out that drawing bundle, and I'll leave a link to my course website and to my Patreon in the description below. Now let's move on to the actual drawing process, and I always start off by having the sketch outline down on my paper first before I go in with any of my charcoal pencils to do the shading. But I don't actually use a charcoal pencil to get in my sketch outline. For my sketch outline, I always start off by using a graphite pencil for this, and that is for 2 reasons. Firstly, because graphite is easier to erase if you make a mistake than charcoal, and also graphite tends to be lighter than charcoal pencils. But one thing you'll want to avoid doing is pressing too hard with your graphite pencil, because not only will this make your drawing look more cartoony if your outlines are really harsh, but also the charcoal won't be able to layer on top of the graphite if the graphite is really heavy down on the paper. So once you've got in your sketch outline, make sure it's really accurate before you go in with your charcoal shading, because once you go in with your charcoal shading, it's really hard to change any proportions or anything like that. So make sure that you're 100% happy with your sketch outline before moving on to the shading process. Now the first step in my drawing process is to use the H and 2B charcoal pencil to add in the first layer of shading. And I start by blocking in the darkest shadows first using that 2B pencil. And then I move on to filling in all of the midtones with the H pencil. So I'm basically blocking in the shadows and the midtones, but with the highlighted areas, I keep them free from any charcoal for now. And at this stage, you really don't need to worry about adding in too many details, because we will be blending this layer out anyway. So if you was to go in and add in lots of details, they will most likely be blended out and smudged over when we blend out with all of our different blending tools. So once you've got in your first layer of shading, it is time to blend out the drawing, and I start off by using my paintbrush to soften out the shading, and I also let some of the charcoal powder on the brush, I let that brush onto the highlighted areas to add a bit of tone to them. So we don't want the highlighted areas to stay completely white, but we don't want to add charcoal directly to these areas either. So like I said, when we're doing our first layer of shading, you don't want to add charcoal directly to the highlighted areas. Instead, the way we tone them is that when we blend with the paintbrush, we brush a bit of that charcoal powder from those darker areas onto those highlighted areas. This way, we are adding a bit of value to them. But when we brush on charcoal, rather than adding it directly with the charcoal pencils, it's actually really easy to lift back up with the eraser. Whereas if you go in directly with the charcoal, that can be hard to erase, like I said earlier. So if you have any large areas in your drawing to blend out, particularly backgrounds, this is when I would go in and use the tissue instead to soften over these areas. So to do this, like I said, I simply wrap the tissue around my finger and I do blend in circular motions, just like you would if you were just using your finger. And so if you notice that the tissue is starting to crumble, make sure you switch to a new piece of tissue. Finally, if you need to blend out any tiny details, then this is when you would go in and use your blending stump. Now, once you blended out that first layer of shading, we've got in the foundation of the drawing, we've built up all of those values, but at the moment we haven't got in any details really. We've just got in the values where they need to be. So the next part of the drawing process is to go in and add in details and the highlights. So like I said, now that we've built up the foundation, we go back in and use our charcoal pencils and the erasers to add in more detail and texture to your drawing. So I start by going back in with the pencils, and I make sure they're really sharp for this stage because we are building up the details, and I start to darken up the main shadows because most probably when you blend out with your paintbrush, it lightens up that really dark shading that you added in because it's brushing that charcoal powder over those lighter areas. And as well as darkening up the shadows, remember we need to use these charcoal pencils to build up the detail and texture in your drawings. So it is also the time where we go in with the erasers like the Tombow Mono Stick Eraser and add in the highlights. So I use this eraser to pull up the highlights whilst adding texture to the drawing. So in this drawing, I'm not only using the eraser to add in the highlights, but I'm also using it to add in the feather texture. So that is basically my process for how I go through the drawing step by step, but one of the biggest problems with using charcoal is smudging. So my main tip for preventing smudging is to simply place a sheet of tracing paper or glassine under your hand, and this will stop your hand smudging your charcoal shading. But I've recently done a video with a lot more tips on how you can prevent smudging, so I'll leave a link to that video up above as a card. But that is just an overview and the basics of the charcoal drawing. So I went through the materials, the blending tools and how to blend using them, and also my steps for building up shading with the charcoal pencils and pulling up highlights with erasers. So I really hope that you found this quick guide useful. Let me know if you want any other videos and tutorials on more in-depth stages of the charcoal drawing process. Let me know your ideas in the comment section, but I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.